the next section goes through ayat and tries to ground the notion of divine science or signification, operative science, and to root that in compassion. God manifests His glory through His creation and gives us the signs, the operative signs, because He is compassionate. Okay? So for me, a proper theological semiotics in Islam has to be a compassion-based semiotics. Semiosis is an abundant thing, but I believe that semiosis is ultimately grounded in the generosity and the abundance of God's compassion. And there is a need to develop semiotics in a way that respects that, so that semiotics doesn't just become a doctrine of pure science. You know, in semiology with Saussure, it becomes a kind of relation between these signifiers that are arbitrary and, in a sense, almost empty of content. And in Peirce, it becomes this triadic thing which indicates some points, but the signs don't do anything, you know. And that I found most frustrating, because either you go with the American semiotics and you find the non-operative signs, or you go to the French semiotics and you find the empty ones. The signs that we talk about in the Quran as ayat are not there. Maybe they are there in Augustinus, in the Doctrina Christiana, with his notion of science to some extent, but even him, because of the Stoic tendency, sometimes makes it a simple point. Maybe it is in St. Bonaventura, in his work on divine road to God, with the notion of vestigia. It's definitely there in Jacob Böhme, with his notion of the signature in the creation. But I've been struggling trying to develop a doctrine of science that will be true to the nature of religious science, these Islamic ayat. Because the ayat, they're almost like little operative artifacts, okay? And when you deal with them, you're dealing with something quite dynamic, and you can't quite predict what happens in the space between you and the divine sign. As a matter of fact, there is a doctrine of bearing the Quran, which is even more fundamentally and existentially troublesome, because as you bear the Quran, you're intaking the operative divine signs that actually transform you from the very inside, so that your very character is shaped from the inside. Okay? So when Aisha, the wife of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, peace be upon her, was asked, what was the character of the Prophet ﷺ like? And she said, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ. His character was the Quran. And here is a man whose very character is, in a sense, a book. I know it sounds a bit strange, especially to modern ears, but anybody who is familiar with Lectio Divina and monastic practice, or with these, what are called sacred modes of reading, would, I think, acknowledge what we're trying to say. The problem is, in modern times, is that sacred hermeneutics has been subsumed under the tyranny of general hermeneutics. Okay? And general hermeneutics has not been always so divinely inspired or sanctified. Okay? I believe that sacred hermeneutics has to have its own ground. Therefore, I don't like these attempts of borrowing from Gadamer and applying it to the Quran, or borrowing from liberation hermeneutics, and you know, as some people like Farid Ishaq and people like Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd have done. I believe that it's a form of blasphemy when you do that. You are supposed to be transformed by the Quran and not vice versa. Okay? If I may have 2 more minutes to talk about Ahmed Rifai, because I intended. Because sometimes when you talk about theological things, people think that, hey, this is very nice and abstract, but it cannot be practiced. So I figured it's very important to show you a paradigm of someone who practices this. And this is a medieval figure called Ahmed Rifai, the founder of the Rifa'iyya Tariqa of Tasawwuf. And I will not bother you with all that I have written on that. I will simply read you a passage which I translated for you. Okay. Master Yaqub, blessed is his essence, said, one day, after just finishing the call for the midday prayer and still standing, I was called by Master Ahmad Rifai, may Allah be pleased with him. So I went to him and he said to me, come down here for Allah's sake. So I found him sitting near the niche in the mosque, and on his hand was a very small living creature, smaller than a mosquito. It was so small you could not see its members. He said to me, Yaqub, look at this. So I looked and was amazed at it and its makeup. I said, what did Allah Exalted intend by creating this thing? What benefit can come of it? He said, Yaqub, ask Allah Exalted for forgiveness. You should not say this. The true, the glorified, intended showing us His creativity and the efficacy of His power. There is great wisdom in this. Then he said, O Yaqub, if someone tells you that there is a creature weaker than this little Ahmad of himself, he said this, do not believe him. So he believed that he was smaller than this little insect. And in another story, and I will conclude, in Ubaidah, there was a diseased dog, so severely afflicted, its skin fell apart and it went blind. It was running around and people found it hard to look at. So it was taken out and thrown outside Ubaidah. This is the city of Ahmad Rifai. Master Rifai learned about the condition of the dog. So he started to take a lamp and go to the dog. He used to take with him ointment and medicine and feed the dog. He also used to take bread and water to it. He even made a shack to provide shade from the sun. He kept frequenting the dog until it was cured. He then heated up water and took it up to the dog and washed it. He kept giving bread and water to the dog and basically walks back into the town with the cured dog. Okay? This man is not a weirdo of the tradition. This is a very orthodox Sufi who's an Ash'arite in theology, a Shafi'i who wrote commentaries on the fiqh of Shafi'i, and who is also a Sufi. Okay? And it is this kind of man that we need today.
Viene spontaneo fare un parallelo tra la compassione nella teologia islamica che lei ha illustrato e la caritas nella teologia cristiana. Le pongo due domande che come domande sono semplici. La prima è questa: come lei vede questo parallelo? In che cosa vede le differenze sostanziali tra la caritas del cristianesimo, Dio ha tanto amato il mondo da dare il suo figlio unigenito, e la compassione nella teologia islamica? E la seconda domanda, molto più pratica, è questa: nella Chiesa cattolica e nelle chiese cristiane la predicazione sulla carità, sull'amore è assolutamente diffusa, è molto generalizzata. Non discuto sulla qualità di questa predicazione, che può essere molto varia, però è comunque molto generalizzata. Le chiedo, la predicazione nel mondo musulmano sulla compassione è generalizzata? Quanto lo è?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Now thank you very much, first of all, for attending. Really, it's a great honor that you're here. Regarding Caritas, there are abundant similarities. And the reason there are abundant similarities is because, as the Quran says, Jesus is a rahmah of Allah Azza wa Jalla. Okay? He is a compassion of God. This is said in the Quran. So I would expect that nothing but rahmah would come from Jesus. Okay? And insofar as Christian theology can celebrate that compassion that was in Jesus and was Jesus, we have tremendous commonality. We, on the other hand, as Muslims, do not believe that it is necessary for God to become flesh or to sacrifice himself on a cross in order to express his compassion. And insofar as Caritas is focused on the crucifixion, or focused on the notion of an incarnated God, we definitely have to part ways on that. We cannot share with you that notion. If a Muslim shares with you that notion, they will not be Muslim. And if a Christian gives up that notion, they will not be Christians anymore. And the strange and painful thing about life is while I am sure because I know that all of you are compassionate beings, that it probably sounds painful to you that someone would deny that because you feel that they are basically scoffing at the compassion of God. And as a Muslim, it also gives me pain that you think it necessary for him to do that, to be compassionate. So, while admitting that we have a commonality that's extremely deep, okay, it also pains me to tell you that we do part ways on the mode of the expression of divine compassion. However, God could have decided not to have Muslims, okay? And God could have decided not to have Christians. But He decided to have both, okay? And there must be wisdom in this, okay? Because we trust in His wisdom. And we trust that this difference between us and the discussion we have because of this difference is extremely important for God for some reason. Okay? He says and promises in the Quran that we shall return to Him one day and He will settle these disputes between us. Okay? And there is a kind of eschatological postponement of the settlement, which some people think is not so important. I believe it is very important. Because this not yet settlement, to use the notion of the not yet of Ernst Bloch, who's a Marxist thinker, or this eschatological verification, to use the terminology of John Hick, is extremely important because by postponing fundamental settlement, we have space to live together in peace. People go crazy when they try to settle their disputes here and now. And when one religion tries to obliterate the other religion because it thinks that it is wrong. You know, Irish Christians, okay, they all talk about compassion, live compassion, but there is a small minority of Irishmen who blow each other up, even though they teach this every day in the church. And Muslims say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and they go and kill each other and kill others as they say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. This is hypocrisy. It doesn't matter where it comes from, you know. You see, it's against God no matter what religion you're from. So when you say there is an abundance of a preaching, it does not necessarily translate into a praxis of compassion. Okay? But when we find, and I'm glad we have some journalists here, including you, good self, when we find examples of compassion, we should celebrate them, you know? When people have nice relations with other religions, or when they do something really nice, the newspapers don't write about it, you know? They don't, or maybe they write a small thing, you know? Why? Why is somebody like Teresa of Calcutta less famous than, you know, some famous terrorists? Why? You know? Why is the daily practice of compassion within the Muslim community and the Jewish community and the Hindu community and the Christian community not celebrated by the press? Is it not more heroic to be compassionate than to cowardly kill somebody? And yet it is not celebrated because we got into this cycle of celebrating the cruel and not celebrating the compassion. You know? So you say, how diffuse is compassion in the Muslim world? It's very diffused. It's all over the place. How diffused is cruelty in the Muslim community? It's also very diffused, all over the place. But the point is, do you really want to dwell on the bad things and forget the good things, one should be even-handed and should talk about all the good things that are also happening, you know? So, ultimately, I believe that compassion is of God, and cruelty is against God. Doesn't matter who does it. Yeah? And when we want to speak about what's in common between us and what's different, the spirit should not be to settle it either way. The spirit should be to compare notes. You know? What does God tell you there? You know? And because these comparisons are very important. I got to know a lot more about Islam and my own faith through being in Pizai, through talking to Christians and Jews. Okay? And I'm sure that many Christians who are working in dialogue feel the same way. You know, that through their work with Muslims and Jews that they become, you know, better Christians. There is nothing threatening about dialogue to faith. On the contrary, strong faith is a precondition and a condition of possibility of true, deep, meaningful dialogue.
Welcome back to know. I hope I'm not lower than the highly spiritual level of your speech, but I have a small question of curiosity, as I know that you have followed the debate after Pope Benedict XVI lesson in Regensburg, and I know that together with Ibn Yahya, you have both trying to organize a follow-up with a meeting between the delegation of the ulema that addressed an open letter to the Pope and with the Pope himself. Could you give us your personal viewpoint on the Pope's declaration of irrationality concerning other religions besides Christianity and particularly Islam? And wouldn't you think that this clash between religions and Christianity, combined with the Hegel philosophical theories, can lead to a confessional exclusivism and maybe eventually to a new sort of fundamentalism? Why couldn't we reconsider, as you said, that compassion bridged the gap between orthodoxy and epistemology? Could we recognize the three dimension of supra-rational, alakla, intellectual, rather than rational, and bridge the gap between reason and faith? Thank you.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa mawlah. I felt very apologetic about taking so long to answer the first question. I'm now really worried about how long it's going to take to answer this one. But let me try to be as brief as I can. First of all, alhamdulillah, thanks to God, because I was watching the news after that famous lecture, and I could see that the reactions were not very nice, very emotional, sometimes violent. I felt a particular obligation to write a reasoned response to the Pope's lecture. And much to my surprise, but the Lord works in mysterious ways, it has had quite a wide circulation, mainly through the good offices of Dr. Magister, who published it on Keza, and then it got translated into Spanish and French and Arabic. So I want to leave the philosophical aspect of the reply to that paper, because I think it's more appropriate. It takes a while, especially about Hegel and so on. I think I sufficiently deal with that to some extent in the paper. Now, regarding the response, something which is unprecedented happened. Okay? For the first time, I would think, in centuries, 38 very eminent Muslim scholars and ulama, and these are people with official titles like Mufti and, heads of theological faculties, and the ministers of Al-Qa'ah signed the letter addressed to the Pope, in which I believe they were quite reasonable. I believe that they were so quite reasonable that when they added the more signatures to the document, I myself signed the document. So I feel that that letter was quite reasonable, congenial, polite, respectful, and that it deserves an answer from the Pope himself, and not just from officers of the Vatican. Because the Pope is a scholar, and as a alim within his own tradition, he should respect the ulama of another tradition and respond to them alim to alim, scholar to scholar, as he himself celebrated his scholarship in the German university. So, qua scholar, he must reply scholarly, preferably in book form, because these issues are very important. So I would hope and pray that the Pope will write a book on this, because I think it deserves a book. And the fact that Muslim ulama got together and had what we call an ijma' or a consensus is extremely important. Part of the problem of the West with Islam today is that after the destruction of the Ottoman Khilafah, which was thought to be a good thing for Western powers at the time, the fragmented Muslim community no longer had a centralized Shaykh al-Islam or office or a Grand Mufti office that can unify the voices. And because of that, normativity and authority within the community got fragmented. So you have a serious crisis of voices, a polyphony, to use Bakhtin's terminology, that is almost deafening because of the multiplicity. You cannot really figure out what these Muslims want to say, you know. The ulama have been undermined by the Western powers, then by their own secular governments, and by their own doing to some extent through weak discipline and scholarship in some cases, and corruption, and most importantly, the deprivation of the ulama of the endowments, which became part of the ministries of waqf, and thereby the ulama lost their ability to be impartial and their ability to be the conscience of the community. So, for me as a Muslim, for 38 of my shuyukh to meet together and have a consensus is a blessed event that should be celebrated, not by only Muslims, but by the West in general. I don't mean only Christian communities, but also even political communities, because it's extremely important to rehabilitate the role of the scholarly ulama who have the proper lineage. So when 38 people get together and they write something like this, it's very important that there is a reply. The way I interpret it, even though some Muslims think that that the Vatican maybe has been a bit disrespectful and have not replied and so on, the way I see it is that I think, solemnly think, that the Pope realized how deep the problem is, and that through his busy schedule, he is trying to have the time to reflect and pray and really think about this and consult with the experts so that he can himself write the proper reply. So I take the silence as a good sign, as the sign of someone who has recognized the gravity of what has happened and the importance of the message, and that he will himself, in a humble, prayerful, Christian, saintly manner, deal with the issues that were presented to him in a scholarly way. So I believe the ulama deserve a reply, and I say that if there is no reply eventually, it's definitely a problem. Okay? But at the same time, I do not want to accuse the Pope or the Vatican of being so negligent or arrogant as not to reply to the Muslim scholars. So I believe that there is an answer coming, inshallah. I pray for it, for the sake of the peace between our communities. And I believe that the Pope does have the scholarly depth and the wisdom and the spiritual maturity to recognize the importance of what has happened. And so, let me put it this way. What I want to say in terms of a reply to the lecture, I've already done in the paper. And I'm really grateful that Professor Martinetti actually replied back, though Magister played a strange trick by giving it a bad title. And he got me to reply a very nasty way, and then Martinetti replied a very nice way, and now it's on me, the onus is on me to reply. But he has entered such deep waters of ontology and logic that I am now very tired and I cannot quite swim in these deep seas. So inshallah, I promised him that I will answer. So there is a good scholarly debate going on, and you know, in the Quran it says, "Asa an takrahu shay'an wa huwa khayrun lakum." Sometimes bad things bring good things. And then, inshallah, we should try to make the best out of the situation, rather than condemn or be angry. We don't need anger, you know. We have enough of it. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam commands us not to be angry. He says, "La taghdab," do not be angry. And then the man asked for more advice, and he said, "La taghdab," do not be angry. And then he asked for even more advice, and he said, "La taghdab," do not be angry. So when the Prophet of God, blessed be he, repeats, "Do not be angry, do not be angry, do not be angry," and I get angry on behalf of the Prophet, there is a bit of a problem. Okay? There is something which is called being angry for God, okay? But it's not the way people interpret it, you know, of taking justice in their own hands and breaking things, and this is not the way to do it. So I believe that because of the wisdom of the ulama, may Allah bless them, and the effort they made in this letter, and because I know that for sure that these ulama had a great niyyah in doing this because they wanted peace, I am sure that God will make the best out of this and will inspire the Pope to write a proper reply. I am honored that Mr. Suhail Nakhuda, the editor of the magazine that first published that letter, is actually flew in from Jordan to be with us today, which is very kind of him, and I greet you and I thank you for your presence.
Dr. Arif, one question which I have here. I think that the first question weighs an indication when just opposed caritas to the Islamic conception of God. I think that of all the totality of human actions that occur in a day around the world, only those that are negative hit the headlines. But they are, you know, very disproportionate to the good that people do. Now, in terms of the new kalam, all of us, of course, many of us in the Muslim tradition are promoting the same thing. But the dilemma that we face now, that none of us, at least those that follow the traditional line, want a reformation in a way that is asked by many liberal theologians in the West. Because that means, in a way, giving up a traditional font of wisdom that is difficult to part with. But in our search to move tradition forward, whether it is rahmatology or whatever ology we want to develop, the difficulty now we face is that our ulama, or those that are trained in our old universities, have been disconnected to the spiritual base. So while Ibn Khaldun would have thought, you know, decades or centuries ago, that during his time, tasawwuf was the spiritual sciences were actually taught in the curriculum. Now they're not. So, is it possible for a Muslim theologian to develop a compassion-based theology without undergoing a deep training in his own tradition and at the same time deep training in the spiritual sciences of his tradition?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa la. I shall try to address your question in two parts. Part one is regarding the Reformation, and part two regarding the spiritual education. About the Reformation. You know, I see it in The Economist and Newsweek, in Time, you know. The Muslims must have the Reformation. The Muslim must have the Reformation, you know. I find that most annoying, by the way, you know. It's first of all, you are imposing a criterion that does not belong to us. It belongs to your own history, and you're doing it to. And secondly, with all due respect to the Protestants, and including the Anglicans I work with in Cambridge on theological issues, the Reformation was not all roses, you know. It was not all so wonderful. People forget how many people died during the wars after the Reformation. You know, people want us to have another French Revolution. They forget the reign of terror of the French Revolution. So I'm not into borrowing criteria like that. Secondly, the notion of Islah or repair in our own tradition is very, very different from Reformation in the Christian tradition. However, it is quite a valid mode of fixing things. You know, that we have an entire hermeneutics of repair, which we call Islah. Nowadays, you know, people misuse this word. They call it Islah when they're actually changing the whole thing, you know. So it's like you send your car to the repair shop to repair, and you give them a Mercedes and it comes back a Volkswagen, you know. So, and they call that reformation or Islah or repair. To repair is re-articulation. It is not changing the divine message. The divine message is eternal in its source. It cannot be changed. However, it can be re-articulated. Now, the Catholics are experts on this. You know, and you read these encyclical letters and it says, as our predecessor of good memory says, and in quoting the predecessor, there is a reshaping and a rehabilitating and a okay? So the change happens, but it happens with discipline. And it happens with continuity. See? I believe in that kind of change. I am not into, you know, let me invent a new Muslim theology kind of discourse. Okay? So I very much feel and would like to meet my maker as an Ash'ari, okay, theologian, in continuous line with Ghazali and Fakhr Razi and Baqillani, rahmatullahi alayhi. Okay? At the same time, I do recognize that just as al-Baqillani borrowed some of the Stoic logic in order to write the Insaf, and that just as Ghazali borrowed a bit of Aristotle's logic to write the Iqtisad fil-I'tiqad, that it is also my duty to maybe borrow a little bit and learn a little bit from hermeneutics and semiotics and speech active and philosophy of language and logic. So, let me put it this way. The reformation we need is something that we have already the tools for from within, and we must work it out our own way. It cannot be imposed upon us from the outside, nor can we borrow the pattern of Luther, because while I very much respect the writings of Luther, I do not feel that he did it the right way, okay? And the evidence is the development of something like 700 sects within 100 years, and bloodshed in the hundreds of thousands of people, basically. So that's about the Reformation. About the spiritual basis and the Sufi tradition, there is something very tragic that happened to our Ummah, and I don't like to speak about, you know, there's this communal thing where Christians don't like to speak about other Christians in front of Muslims, and Muslims don't like to speak about other Muslims in front of Christians, because it could very well be seen as a cheap way of scoring points. Okay? And I very much respect everybody who's a Muslim and see them as my brothers, and, you know, I pray for them, okay? All of that. However, there is something very tragic that happened in the history of this Ummah, especially in the history of our theology, whereby it became very convenient for the British, and I don't mean British religious people, but the British Empire, to simultaneously destroy the political integrity of the Ottoman Empire, but also the theological integrity of the Ottoman Empire by supporting the Wahhabi theology. And after the oil was discovered in the Saudi Arabia and so on, America as a political power continued the support of the Wahhabi state, okay? Whereby Wahhabism became much bigger than what it really is. It is a small sect that is definitely, according to the, not only my opinion, but the opinion of two muftis and two people with proper lineage or ijazat, it is a deviation from the Orthodox theology. And one of its most important deviations is the neglect of spiritual inheritance and spiritual communication of things like compassion and purity of heart and humility and things like that. So there is a crisis. It is simultaneous from within, because of especially Arabs who, and of course later on some Indians and some Pakistanis who inherited this, I would say, malfunctional theology, because I judge theology by its fruits. And when a theology produces bad fruits, it is bad theology. Okay? So I believe that the wholesome theology of old, which does need big repair work, okay, and it needs revamping, true, but the fundamentals of it are, I think, quite solid. And that old theology was simultaneously logical, ontological, epistemic, ethical, and spiritual. And it's a very rich tradition. And I believe that Muslims should do their best to maintain that and to develop it further. There are signs after 9/11 of people recognizing some of this, and some of the ulama are regaining some of their prominence. The phenomenon of Sidi Ali al-Jifri, for example, and his Taba Foundation, the phenomenon of Sidi Saeed Ramadan al-Muti, Hafidahullah of Syria, the Ali Jum'ah of Egypt. There is beginning to be again some shining forth of the ulama. And that's very, very nice. You know, I support that kind of trust, you know. And I feel that it is extremely important for the integrity of our ummah and for preventing people from committing crimes in our name. Okay? Thank you.
And how can we take the theology of jihad and find a solution? We must leave that to others. But as people, ordinary people involved in interreligious relations, how can we, and I ask specifically for Nigeria, not that you will give solutions, but at least a lead on how can we get the very ordinary people, right from children, people who might in one sense be illiterate. And remember, Nigeria is the only country in the world that has a 50-50% practically Muslim, Christian divide, so therefore there isn't a majority or minority. Are there any ways you can suggest that we can overcome the many types of ologies which are being practiced both by Muslim and by different Christian sects? What can we emphasize in order that the people, because the killings in Nigeria were done by ordinary people, not by, perhaps aggravated by the leaders, but done by the ordinary people who did not understand.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani. Now, I find it not only painful but difficult to respond to practical situations like Nigeria because it's very complex. Most of situations of violence today between Muslims and Christians actually turn out to be motivated by many complex factors, including how to divide up oil, including territorial claims, including tribal hegemony and tribal relations. And people really love God in the wrong way sometimes, by loving to cover up their own egoistic political, social, economic, tribal, ethnic problems by giving them a godly paint job. So by claiming that it is Muslim versus Christian, Christian versus Muslim, and that is very, very tragic. The abuse of language, of religiosity, whereby it is used to cover up things like that is a tragedy. So I don't believe that the problem in Nigeria is a religious problem per se, but a problem of people who critically paint their ethnic and their economic struggles with religion. That being said, however, theologians and the ulama, the priests and monks and teachers have a responsibility, a grave responsibility to try to instill this love of God and compassion and the love of neighbor into the hearts of their people. And part of the crisis in education today in some parts of the world has to do with the breakdown of mechanisms of spiritual upbringing and the non-replacement of these obliterated mechanisms. Many countries that had old madrasas that taught tasawwuf and taught things like love and compassion lost their madrasas to secular schools who think that it is very rational and secular to keep religion out of the school. So they don't give any spiritual nourishment to the children. Thereby we have these creatures who are highly educated and awfully cruel. As a matter of fact, most of the most cruel people that we have heard about in the news lately are highly educated people, normally engineers. Okay? And that is, I'm trained as an engineer, by the way, before theology and so on. So I mean no disrespect to the engineers, but what I mean is a purely technical education without spiritual upbringing is more problematic than being illiterate or ignorant, because at least the illiterate, because he humbly knows that he's illiterate, doesn't do arrogant things. But the foremost arrogance comes from the literate, the highly literate, when they are illiterate spiritually. And how do you teach spirituality? You can definitely develop theologies, you can preach it, but most importantly, you must practice it. Yeah? Because example, when it comes to these things, is the best teacher. It's like riding a bicycle. You can write as many manuals about riding bicycles as you can, it will never work. To ride a bicycle, your father has to put you on that bicycle, or your mother, and has to help you out a little bit until you're on your own, and then let you ride the bicycle. This is what Gilbert Ryle calls knowing how, not knowing that. And spirituality has a lot to do with knowing how, which is only taught through proper lineage and transmission of a barakah, or a blessing, that is done generation after generation. What we see in the world today is the rupture of these ancient structures and the non-replacement of these things. So that is why we have a spiritual crisis. May God give peace to Nigeria and to all the troubled parts of our world, Iraq and Afghanistan, and Lebanon, Philippines. May He give them all peace and mercy and compassion. Okay.
Thank you very much, and I know that there are many questions, and we are very thankful to you for the interest in submitting questions, but the time is over. Therefore, just simply to remind you that afterwards you are all kindly invited to the court for taking a refreshment, and to remind you that from June the 24th, there will be a summer course on tensions in contemporary Islam for 3 weeks until the 13th of July. If you are interested, you may get further information in reception. And nothing else but to thank the Bradley Foundation for the kindness in giving us this chance of having participated to Dr. Aref's lecture.